Well, hello there, my friends. It's great to be with you all again for my fourth drawing video, and that's this channel's seventh overall. If you haven't seen Kolai's three previous drawing videos, I'd really like to recommend them. Unlike me, Kolai is a whiz at Photoshop, so he presents a whole slew of different techniques that are honestly impossible for me to show you, since I'm an MS Paint noob, strictly. You can really see the difference between our two comics, especially since he uses Photoshop. His balls are just so much smoother than mine. With this video today, I'm going to be drawing in the classical style. So, no backgrounds and no shading. Both look really nice, but honestly, they're really not necessary for the plot of this comic. Moreover, I'm going to be dealing with drawing a lot more characters this time. In the past, I mostly just drew, two or three, mostly Canada, which is pretty easy. So this time I'm going to do something a little bit different. And to shade everything would turn into an hours long bonanza. And honestly, I don't think I can run my mouth for that long. It would be fun to try, but it would be pretty irritating, I think. As with the previous times, I have the flags I plan to use at the bottom of the canvas. I took these images just like before, directly from Wikipedia to make sure the colors are correct, because it always looks better this way. Now, I imagine by just looking at the flags being used, you've probably already guessed that this comic will be about one of the most boring yet high stakes conflicts that we've ever faced, and that is the Cold War. I've actually sat on this comic idea for a while. I just really never got around to it, mostly because I couldn't think of a proper punchline. Now, honestly, let me tell you, thinking of punchlines is really hard. You get good concepts, good build ups, and then just to find that perfect punchline to put it all together is actually really quite difficult. And honestly, sometimes it would be quite annoying. Um, the punchline for this one is it's kind of lame, but anyways, we'll get to that when we get to that. I always liked making comics about the Cold War. It really harkens back to the olden days when America and Russia just bickered back and forth and, were constantly one-upping each other. Wait, that sounds like today. Guess the olden days aren't so old after all. Man, these two really need to grow up. But anyways, like I was saying, I think it allows for some great situations and really jokey conflicts. I think one of my favorite comics that I've ever personally made was one about the Cold War. I want to say it was about 9 or 10 years ago, 2014, I believe. But instead of nuclear warfare, I have the situation set up as two cliques of very angry school children, and they're all trying to one up each other with snow forts, with each snow fort getting progressively bigger than the last, and their snow, I guess, snowball arsenal, you want to call it, keeps growing bigger and bigger. And you have, I think Russia led one clique and the US led the other, and more people joined, blah blah blah. And of course, to anybody who has grown up with snow, I'm sure you've all been in this kind of situation with the snow fort wars. I remember back then the recess bell would hit and you charge out there like a raging bull to quickly try and save your fort. Because naturally, kids are pretty cruel. So the first thing they want to do when recess hits, when you're not there to defend your castle, is to just kick it right down. And I won't lie either. I mean, I had my fair share of sieges on other kids' forts. Those were the good old days for sure. A lot of friendships and enemies made. So I'm going for something vaguely similar with this comic, except instead of playground snow fort war, it's going to be a teeter-totter war with America and the Soviet Union just seeing their sides teeter-totter back and forth between being strong and weak. And naturally, they want to fix that because obviously they want to be the strongest, and that was the whole point of the Cold War. So that's what I'm going for here today. If you guys were wondering about the teeter-totter, which was poorly drawn, by the way, I'm really sorry about that. This is about the point in the comic where I would expect to see those famous, well, actually, comments because, wow, this is not historically accurate in the slightest. I think the only thing I'm really going to get factually correctly is the fact that the Korean War really kind of kicked off the violence between these two factions, and I have that featured first. Oh, yeah, and the ending will be accurate too. That's all we really need, right? And we don't even really need that. As the line goes, and people like myself repeat this until they're red in the face, accuracy in my Polandball? It's less likely than you think. For one thing, I know that China and the Soviet Union weren't actually on the best terms, despite both of them being communists. Looking back to the Cold War, people always lump those two in together as if they were thick as thieves, but they weren't. Ergo, we get the Sino Soviet split in the early 1960s. I don't know much about it past the fact that it began in the 60s, but I know that these two had a few border clashes between them, and during that time, shots were fired, and folks. uh, didn't make it home. But since America is the main character of the entire universe and he doesn't like communists, I stuck China and the Soviet Union in the same camp. One other thing that relates to the inaccuracies in this comic, which is kind of funny, is having Vietnam and China together on the teeter-totter, or maybe it's a seesaw, whatever you want to call it. I know the USA and Vietnam weren't the best of friends back in ye old times. I mean, they did nearly fight for 2 whole decades. In hindsight, it's kind of funny because now they're pretty close. I have a Vietnamese friend though, and he told me, I'm going to paraphrase because I don't quite remember it, something along the lines of, we fought the Americans for 20 years, we fought the Cambodians, I think it was the Cambodians, for hundreds of years, and we fought China for over 1,000 years. So why would we hate Americans? Where I'm going with this is the fact that right after the United States left the Vietnam War and returned home, the Chinese invaded Vietnam right after. Oh, those poor guys. It's like none of these communist nations could ever really get along. No wonder communism failed. These two conflicts were wildly different, though, especially when you take into consideration their whole duration. It took Vietnam almost just over 3 weeks to defeat China and send them packing. Meanwhile, it took the USA 20 years to be defeated. You know what that means? America wins again. Yeehaw, y'all. Point one for America and 0 points for communism. Boy, howdy. I will say, though, I really like to draw these communist countries. They're so easy and unoriginal. With the West, you've got annoying flags like the United Kingdom, the United States. Oh boy, Canada's old flag back in the day. Gosh, what a mess. That one takes forever to draw. Whereas with these communist countries, it's just red countries with red stars here and there, depending on, which country it is. China gets their little red stars up in the corner. Vietnam gets his in the center. Russia gets the hammer and sickle up in the corner with one red star. They're like a really dysfunctional family, and they're such a pleasure to draw. Even North Korea has a preferable flag, in my opinion. Not that it looks better, it's pretty bland and unoriginal. I mean, it's just red and more stars. At least they tossed in white this time. But dang, that South Korean flag, I mean, you've watched me draw it a few times now. I will never ever learn the pattern of those lines. It is a fine flag though. As far as drawing goes, I'm very fortunate that this small organization, you may or may not have heard of it, called NATO exists. Thankfully, with NATO, instead of drawing the UK, Canada, West Germany, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, Portugal, Spain, Norway, Iceland, and Denmark, I can just draw a singular character, and an easy one at that. Thanks, NATO. You keep my house safe, and you just saved me from a carpal tunnel. Now that is an A-plus organization. NATO is somehow and very miraculously going to be outweighed by a singular Soviet Union in this second to last panel. Now, ignoring nukes, we know that it's complete hooey dooey. But I needed to set up my punchline of the grand collapse of the Soviet Union somehow. And why not use an inaccuracy and some innocent misinformation? Soviet Union is dead and gone now anyways, not like they're here to complain. Although I could always take a physical, scientifical defense and just say, well, the Soviet Union is like, it's really big and stuff and like lots of landmass and all that. They got all the stands and they got like the Baltics and whatever. So, maybe they would physically weigh more to counterbalance NATO on the teeter-totter, especially considering America's not on it. And we know that Americans, they're, how to say, robust. Like, Canada's landmass is pretty big and heavy, I guess, but yeah, it still doesn't compare to the to the grandeur of the Soviet Union. And moreover, all of the other European countries who are going to stand on the teeter-totter, they're all really small. So actually, no, I recant. It makes total sense. Now, in the past, you probably noticed that I was using those yellow lines a lot, especially when I drew America. I didn't really do that this time. I don't necessarily really have even a good explanation for it. I think it might have just been laziness and the fact that I was using a lot of close-up shots for the US, and I find it's a lot more forgiving because when he's expanded to take up a third of the screen, you can actually like really get in there and get into the nitty-gritty and draw the stars correctly without going over the lines. But I do kind of regret not using those thick yellow lines to really clean it up, but live and learn, right? Alrighty then, here we are, panel 6. This is the final panel for this comic. If you remember that I had mentioned earlier that I had this idea for a while without a punchline in mind, well, you're going to see that punchline now. And if anything, it makes reference to what I was saying earlier about the Soviet Union being physically heavy enough to counterbalance the actual physical weight of the NATO countries on this small children's playground toy. The Soviet Union is about to meet someone who is a lot more physically heavy than them. Someone heavy enough that their mere presence on this teeter-totter is going to fling the Soviet Union into oblivion and cause the grand collapse of the early 90s. The United States. Yep, I'm ending this with a fat joke. Cheap, but whatever. The classics, come on. America being fat is a staple of Polandball, and honestly, I thought it would be the perfect way to send this one off. And the Soviet Union, too, evidently. Put the finishing touches on this comic since this isn't a close-up shot of the United States. I went back to using that yellow outline that I mentioned earlier and I had used in my other vids since it gives me a lot of wiggle room to be messy. Wiggle room that really isn't needed on those close-up shots since you can be more intricate, really. Um, I find this way I can draw the stars and stripes out of the line and I can very easily fix it afterwards instead of, going in there with like a microscope and a scalpel and trying to draw these stars. That's a pain in the arse. And honestly, with these few finishing touches, I think we're pretty much done. I've added some motion lines to show the Soviet Union getting launched into collapse, I guess. Sorry, guys. And yeah, that's it. I really appreciate you guys tuning in again. So let's see this final product, the longest one that I've made so far, at least for this channel. Do 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 do. Do 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 do.